Hello and welcome to week 9 of government. And believe it or not, this unit that we'll be talking about this week actually concludes our study of the Constitution. Now, of course, it'll come up here and there as we go along. It is the supreme law of the land, so you're not going to be able to talk about U.S. government without bringing the Constitution into the fray at some point. But in terms of examining the Constitution from start to finish, this will wrap up things. I'm going to try to keep this to an hour, but quite honestly, what we're going to talk about today, that is, all the parts of the Constitution we haven't already mentioned, includes some of the nuts and bolts issues of what it means to be living in a free nation. A lot of this is very fundamental, and it is absolutely necessary, and I take it to heart. If you couldn't tell already, I am someone who absolutely loves individual liberty. I love freedom. And the portion of the Constitution we'll be looking at today not only talks about freedom, but it outlines it. It sets the foundation for our definition of freedom. And it is constantly under attack. Not under direct assault, but people want to take a little here, a little there. That age-old battle between freedom and security. Are you willing to give up a little bit of freedom to be a little safer? That's a question that in a free society we will be grappling with forever. At the end of this, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that we will kind of consider as essay questions and talk about it in class Monday after we get all this in. So again, we'll go back to that. Right now, I'm going to just say I apologize for the week 8 questions being late. Life happened this week. So I'll give you your week 8 questions here shortly, and you'll have until next week to get them completed, along with the week 9 quiz, which I hope to not have to wait so long to do. Anyway, we're wrapping up the Constitution by looking at the remainder of the articles. Article 4 and the rest of them. The rest of these articles deal mostly with relations among the states, relations between the states and the federal government, the process by which a constitution can be amended, and so forth. A lot of this is going to be, again, kind of on an FYI basis. I'm not going to require you to know an awful lot of this, but we will skim over it very quickly just so you know it does exist. And again, for most contingencies, there's something in the Constitution to act as a guiding or governing principle. Article 4, Section 1 refers to the full faith and credit. Basically, states are supposed to recognize laws and records and court actions that come from other states. That does not apply to licenses for professional. If you're a lawyer that's licensed in Virginia, you cannot practice in North Carolina without getting a license. If you represent a case in North Carolina, you have to be approved as an out-of-state attorney. If you're a doctor, you're licensed by state and so forth. Otherwise, legal documents in one state, if you make a will in Virginia and die in North Carolina has to honor the provisions of the will created in Virginia so long as it doesn't violate any specific part of North Carolina, that kind of thing. States sometimes have reciprocity agreements. That is to say, if you got a fishing license in one state, then that fishing license is good in the other state as well. Those come and go, but again, these are issues that are largely left up to the states, and the Constitution gives the states some direction that if it's okay in this state and it doesn't violate anything wrong in your state, then you generally have to honor it. Again, exceptions noted. Section 2 of Article 4 is about privileges and immunities, and even to this day, we're kind of trying to figure out exactly what the heck this means. It's kind of ambiguous, but the consensus is that a state cannot discriminate against citizens of other states in terms of legal rights and protections and whatnot. That is to say, if you are the state of Virginia, you cannot forbid travelers from other states, like from Maryland, going through your state to get to North Carolina. That kind of thing. It's a sovereignty issue, but it forces states to not separate themselves almost as a non-entity. As a state, you can charge higher fees for certain things for out-of-state residents, like a fishing license, college tuition, because the taxpayers in that state are paying for the services there. However, the Supreme Court has ruled that has to be reasonable. You can't charge a resident $3 for a fishing license and charge a non-resident $200. It has to be justifiable from a financial point of view. Second paragraph requires the extradition of a fugitive back to a state. If you rob a bank in Danville and escape to Greensboro, North Carolina, they arrest you in Greensboro on a warrant from Danville unless there is a compelling reason stated by the governor of that state, then you pretty much have to be extradited back to Virginia. Section 3 has to do with U.S. territories. Now remember, when the Constitution was adopted, the United States was 13 colonies. It was a bunch of regions on the coast of this great large continent. Section 3 has to do with the dealing of territories and how we add them. No state can be formed within an existing state. No state can be formed by joining two or more portions of states unless the state legislatures agree and Congress agrees. There's still technically a constitutional question about the formation of West Virginia. The counties in Western Virginia at the time were pretty much unanimously against secession from the Union. Again, there was not much in the way of slavery done in the mountains of Virginia. The agriculture industry there simply did not demand that type of labor. And the counties basically petitioned the U.S. government after Virginia seceded. They asked the U.S. government, hey, we want to join you as a state. Congress probably took a couple of constitutionally questionable actions to get West Virginia admitted to the Union. It was an aberration to the normal process, most certainly. But when the Civil War was over and Virginia entered the U.S., one of the provisions of them being welcomed back into the Union is you got to be okay with West Virginia being a state. So it's really now legally a moot point. Section 3 also covers the vast U.S. territories overseas. You'll see here. It's not really an empire. Almost all of these entities that you're seeing here have their own local governments. They are, in many cases, what's called a U.S. protectorate. Puerto Rico, probably the most common or the most known of these. Puerto Rico is not a state, although that's going to be an issue for debate soon at some point. They do not have statehood, but they are under the full protection of the United States. If a foreign nation invaded Puerto Rico, the United States is obligated to militarily protect them. That kind of thing. A lot of these out in the ocean are just little small islands. The Marshall Islands, you can walk across that in 1 hour. I mean, it's not very big at all. The idea was, after World War II, we had this big old threat in the top part of Asia called Russia. And the fear was they might attack us with conventional or unconventional nuclear warheads. And the possession of territory in the middle of the Pacific Ocean was supposed to give us kind of an early warning. Well, the way technology is now, you're not going to get a warning. So these are really kind of superfluous territories. The addition of Hawaii as a state in 1959, along with Alaska, one of the reasons was, again, that to give us that early warning system, that protection of sorts against the bad old Russians. Again, the way technology is today, it makes it a moot point, but Alaska and Hawaii are still states. Guam, the Marshall Islands, Palmyra Atoll, the Reef, gosh knows, Kingman Island, Kingman Reef, I think it is. I used to be able to name all these. American Samoa, Guam, all of these are still what's called U.S. protectorates. Anyway, not going to require you to remember much about that. But that is it's just something to know. We do have territories overseas. The last part of Article 4, federal guarantees to the state. They promise each state will have a Republican form of government. That is to say, in any state in the United States, you're going to have representation. It's going to be Democratic Republic in that case. Each state has a constitution. Again, you have to... if you're going to do business as a state in the United States, you're going to have to act a certain way, basically. All right. So we will move on to Articles 5, 6, and 7. The final 3 articles deal with the amendment process and a few other issues. The Founding Fathers, of course, knew when they drafted the Constitution that at some point it was going to have to be changed to some degree. Although they got the basics very, very right, if you ask me, and ask most other peoples, they did realize that there were going to be some things that needed to be changed. They wanted to set up a process that would not be easy. They didn't want it to be changed at a moment's notice, but they also wanted it to be possible. Under the old Articles of Confederation, change was almost impossible statistically. But this is right now the process we have for a constitutional amendment. There are two ways that an amendment can be proposed. It can be proposed by 2/3 of Congress or 3/4 of the states. It has to be ratified by both 2/3 of Congress, 3/4 of the states. There's only been one constitutional amendment, I think, which arose from a state question. Most all of them start in Congress, and that would make sense. It's easier to get 2/3 of Congress to agree on something rather than a grassroots effort to involve 3/4 of the state legislatures. Both those numbers are very hard to get. 2/3 majority on anything in Congress is very difficult. 3/4 of the states to agree on something is very, very difficult if there's any controversy at all around it. Some amendments go by very quickly because they're very obvious, and we'll get to them in a second. But yeah, that's a high threshold. It's not impossible. We've amended the Constitution 27 times. Really, in terms of the number of times, the first 10 were all at once. So yeah, 18 times since the adoption of the Bill of Rights, we have amended the Constitution. So it's not impossible, but you see, you've got to have a broad section of support. This, after a week in which we've been looking at election returns of 51% versus 49%, separated by just a little bit. No, the constitutional amendment's not going to get passed by a simple majority. You've got to have 2/3 of Congress, 3/4 of the State House, and good luck. First 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights. I think most of us knew that. We're going to get to that in just a second. I think I might have jumped the gun here a little bit. The Article 6 of the Constitution is sort of a mop-up type thing that has to do with various matters. Basically, the Constitution declared that the new government would honor the debts incurred under the Articles of Confederation. Here's a big part of Article 6 that is still debated today. You'll remember my favorite constitutional amendment is the 10th Amendment. Powers not specifically given to Congress are reserved for the states. Well, Article 6 has something which sort of muddies the picture a little bit, but not really. It's called the Supremacy Clause. It recognizes, first off, that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. State judges have to recognize the Constitution above their own state laws. When there is a conflict between a federal law and a state law, the federal law is the one you have to follow. That is the Supremacy Clause. South Carolina threatened to nullify a federal law in 1832 by simply by passing a resolution saying we're not going to follow this. The Supreme Court ruled you have to, or you're in violation of the Constitution, because the Constitution is a higher law than your state law. When in doubt, the Constitution outranks the state law, or federal law outranks state law. The last part of Article 6 calls for no religious test. It also administers or talks about the oaths of office that government employees and elected officials have to take. It also forbids there being any sort of religious test. That is to say, if you're Catholic, I'm not going to vote for you for the Supreme Court seat, which was an issue a couple of weeks ago. 6 states have in their constitution requirements that office holders, jurors, and witnesses in court have to believe in God. This would prevent unbelievers from holding government. The Supreme Court, not surprisingly, held that is very, very, very unconstitutional. The last article of the Constitution is very straightforward. It has to do with the ratification of the Constitution. Very quick, very straightforward. If 9 states pass this, it is hereby ratified, and of course, it was. Let's get to the meat of the constitutional amendments. We've looked at the body of the Constitution. These are the additions. The idea of living in a free government is that the government exists to serve the people, not the other way around. People like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, Federalists, thought that the way the Constitution was written up, with its call for limited government, with its calls for checks and balances, with this and with that, it already had sufficient safeguards to make sure that the government would not dominate the people, that the people would still have individual liberties protected. They thought that what they had at that point, without the amendments, was sufficient to take care of that question. People like Thomas Jefferson said, no, that's not enough. He and others were strong advocates for a very specific Bill of Rights, something that puts down in black and white what we believe all along, the reason behind this whole Constitution, that man was created equal, that government's here to serve us. Simple. They wanted it in clearer terms. Yes, the Constitution, as it was laid out, as the government was laid out, was going to be a government whereby it would be difficult to truly oppress people, but not impossible. It's still possible even with the Bill of Rights, but Thomas Jefferson and the others wanted basically more of a guarantee than what just the Constitution required. James Madison drew up 12 proposed amendments to the Constitution. Only 10 of them were adopted. Those 10, of course, are called the Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights was a crucial element in getting some of the states to pass the Constitution. Some of the states agreed with Jefferson that there were not enough protections for private citizens and other groups in the Constitution by itself. So, yes, the Bill of Rights was necessary to get a couple of reluctant states to sign on to the Constitution. Now, few people are going to argue with the general principle stated in the Constitution. Again, narrow. The question that comes up in constitutional debates is, how do you interpret it? Do we have a very narrow interpretation to restrict the Constitution to the meaning that it was intended to have at the time? Or do we define it in a very loose way, very broadly, to address anything that comes down the turnpike? Well, we have to use the Constitution to address contemporary issues. It is still the governing law of the land. But how do we interpret it? That's the two schools of thought. I happen to be in the first one, that the Constitution should be narrowly defined, because if it's not, it can mean anything you want it to mean, and then it becomes meaningless. If you can give it whatever meaning you want, what's the point of even having it in the first place? The Founding Fathers realized the absolute importance of the right to free speech to a society. Governments throughout history had controlled people by controlling information, by controlling the transfer of ideas. For most of history, illiteracy took care of that for them, and the church, for that matter. For most of human history, the difference between the power and the powerless, powerful and powerless, was the powerful could read. They could share ideas. They could share resources. The illiterate really could not under that type of system. It's often been said that the true test of freedom of speech is determined by how freely those in power allow their opponents to speak. Free speech addresses speech that you don't like. I got some news for you folks. There's no such thing as hate speech. There's only speech that you hate. And that is the very speech that is protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. Why would you need protection for speech you like? You're not going to try to stop that. It's the speech you don't like that is protected, because one day your speech might be seen as bad, and you'll want protection for it. I promise you. Dovetailing freedom of speech is freedom of the press, the freedom of a press to operate without government controls. Certainly the advent of the internet has really prevented this from happening. It would be very, if you had only a handful of newspapers, it would be very easy for the government to exert some influence over them. With a Wild West internet, no, we have too much power as individuals. But again, that internet, even though it was not in existence at the time of the Constitution, that internet is still protected by the First Amendment. Much like, there are certain guns that were not around at the time of the Constitution's writing. They're still covered by another amendment, which we'll get to in a second. Now, the right to free speech and freedom of the press are not absolute. There are exceptions. These have been argued vociferously throughout the years and will continue to be argued. Part of that is a perk of free speech. We can argue this. We have free speech. worry about the day when we cannot debate this. That's when you don't have free speech. The kinds of expression, the kinds of speech that are not protected include libel, slander, defamatory speech. Any speech that presents what was called in one court case a clear and present danger. One other court case called them fighting words. That is, words that are specifically designed to incite violence against a person or a group of persons. If you are threatening someone, that is not protected speech. If you're calling them a name, that is protected speech. They may not like it, but you're not attacking them. They may be mad, but you're not physically attacking them. You can call them names. You can't call for them to be hurt. That's the difference. The other type of speech that is protected is or is not protected, I should say, is so-called dangerous speech. And this, Schneck versus the United States, is the court case, 1919, where President Woodrow Wilson was able to jail several anti-war protesters whom he claimed were a danger to national security. Well, all this time later, there is no evidence that the people that were arrested under the Alien and Sedition Act were threats to national security. President just didn't like them. President didn't think they should be spreading their anti-war speech. He had them jailed. The Supreme Court agreed. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who has been venerated over the years, issued one of the more sickening rulings, I think, in Supreme Court history. If you ever hear somebody say the phrase, "You cannot shout fire in a crowded theater," that person is trying to limit your speech. He's trying to say you can't say anything dangerous, and they want to define what's dangerous. Fire in a crowded theater, for now exactly 100 years, has been used by a lot of people to try to limit what you and I can say. We have to be vigilant. Information is power. The control of the flow of information is power. Because there is power to be had there, people are going to try to obtain that power. We cannot let them. One thing I will share with you that I share with everyone I talk to. When in doubt, err on the side of too much freedom, not too little. If you err on the side of too much, you can correct it. If you err on the side of too little, you ain't getting it back. Not without something very bad happening. There is also the last little part here. I'll re-share the slide again. The last part has to do with speech that is considered obscene. That is to say, their laws are allowed to permit so-called obscene listing. The 1973 case Miller versus California set up what's called community standards. That was a very good ruling insofar as what is obscene in Bucktussle, Arkansas may not be obscene in New York City. Different community standards. So if we are talking about regulating pornography, obscenity in those two areas, they are allowed to have different standards for that because they are different communities. I like that. It basically turns control of the regulation of obscenities over to not only states but localities even within those states. Now, this does not apply to obscene materials involving children. This applies only to obscene materials or speech that involve consenting adults. Children legally cannot give consent, so the government is more than free to pass laws that restrict obscenity where it involves children. Of course, government set up the Federal Communications Commission. The idea behind the FCC is that the airwaves, the waves through which radio and television transmissions travel, those are considered in the public domain. That is to say, we the people own them. They're publicly owned. No one, no private company can control a bandwidth. I'm buying the 165 kilohertz bandwidth. No, you can't do that. Not here in the U.S. There are other countries where, again, the waves exist there too, but they're not governed by the U.S. Mexico doesn't have any such restrictions like that. You can do whatever you want to in Mexico. But the Federal Communications Commission has done that. And of course, radio and television have to be licensed by the FCC. Although, again, with the internet and with everybody and his brother having a podcast, this is becoming less and less of an issue. And matter of fact, in 1987, the FCC decided to do away with one long-standing doctrine simply because there were so many outlets there it would be impossible to enforce, and we didn't even need it anymore, called the Fairness Doctrine. The idea, again, noble enough, if you run a TV or radio station and you give one side of a viewpoint airtime, you have to give equal time to the other side. Well, you can see how that could be abused. And you can see how it would be very difficult to say, all right, well, that's not an opposing viewpoint. Here's the opposing viewpoint right here. And so the end result, because of all the confusion, was eventually radio and television stations quit doing anything in terms of public debate, public broadcasting, because it just wasn't worth the hassle. So in the FCC in 1987 lifted that, and thank goodness they did. Another question about free speech is, what constitutes speech? Is it just oral? Is it just written? Is it just typed? Is it just written communication? Is it just oral communication? Are acts, things you do, considered speech? A very surprising 5-4 ruling in 1989, the Supreme Court upheld the practice of flag burning, saying it was constitutionally protected free speech. Well, the Supreme Court concluded that the government simply can't prohibit the expression of an idea because society finds the idea offensive or disagreeable. As much as I disagree with burning the flag, they get it absolutely right. We have to be able to peacefully dissent. Burning a flag is still peaceful. Yeah, it makes people angry, but that's your problem. No one's hurt. No one is being threatened. No one's constitutional rights are being curtailed by somebody burning a flag. I hate it. Sickens me. But you got to let people do it. Again, err on the side of too much freedom. Always. The other part of the First Amendment, as it continues on, it mentions free speech, of course, freedom of the press. Also, the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Here in the age of coronavirus, the right of people to peaceably assemble has been infringed upon. Now, the question is it constitutionally okay for government to infringe on a constitutional right because of a pandemic? That is a question courts are settling right now. I say no. I say absolutely not. If the Constitution doesn't apply during a pandemic, then throw the whole thing out. If it doesn't apply during hard times, what's the point of having it? It is exactly for hard times that we have the Constitution to refer to. Our rights to peacefully assemble are being restricted by government. Again, that battle. We're giving away freedom for security. Nobody asked me. Nobody asked me if I wanted to do that. They just took it. I'm a homebody anyway, so it doesn't practically matter, but it does matter. It does matter when the state can tell you you cannot congregate peacefully. Just think about that. That might be something that comes up in class. Again, we have the freedom to assemble peacefully. Now, government can put restrictions on that, like if you want to do a protest down Main Street, they can require, okay, you do it between the hours of 2 and 4 Saturday when we can have enough, protection units here and whatnot. They can put certain conditions on it, but they have to be very careful with that too. Freedom of speech is an ongoing issue. Again, the fact that we can debate it so openly and vigorously means that we have it. If we did not have free speech, we would not be able to debate the lengths of free speech. Thank God we can debate. Let's continue on with another one of my favorites. I suspect a couple of you probably like this too. The Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. I'm going to try to keep this segment under an hour. Yeah. There are two ways you can deal with people. There's reason and there's force. I prefer reason, whether I'm dealing with someone or someone's dealing with me. And I bet you do too. The ability of private firearm ownership increases the odds that the government will deal with people with reason instead of force. It also applies to individual versus individual, but yes, the fact that we have an individual right to own firearms increases the odds that the government is going to deal with us through reason and not force. It doesn't mean it's 100%. Governments can still be tyrannical even if we all, have 9 millimeters, but it increases the odds. It is an effective check. History has taught us that when populaces are unarmed, they're no longer citizens. They're subjects. They're subject to whatever the government wants. Think about the climate in which the Second Amendment was written. Let's bring it up here first off. Here's the wording. Reading that? My only quibble with the Second Amendment is that it is somewhat clumsily worded for the time. I want you to think about this, though. Everyone, one of the common arguments in favor of more gun restrictions is the whole canard about the militia. They say to own a gun, you got to be in the militia, like the National Guard today. Nope. I want you to look at this little meme I popped up here. I love showing these things off. This right here tells you about the conditional clause in the militia. The militia is not the subject of the Second Amendment. The people is the subject of the Second Amendment. The militia is a conditional clause. Think about the climate in which the Second Amendment was written. The founders had just led a successful revolution against an oppressive government. A lot of their victory owed to the fact that private citizens, with their own weaponry, militias if you will, helped out the Continental Army in repelling this government. Well, now the founders realized they were the government, and they had fresh memories of how abusive a government can be. Second Amendment was established to make sure that the government did not have a monopoly on weaponry and thereby a monopoly on force. It was established to offer a check to the people. Doesn't say a dadgum thing in here about hunting. Doesn't say anything in here restricting the caliber of guns. It does not say anything in here about restricting guns in such a manner to make sure the police have bigger guns or the government has bigger guns. It says none of that. It says that because we must defend our shores and because a government that we set up is necessarily going to have armed forces of some sort, that you, the people, have the right to be armed. You have the right to give yourself a reasonable measure of self-protection against a government should it become tyrannical. And I mentioned this last week when we talked about the power that the Supreme Court had. In the 07 decision, District of Columbia versus Heller, the court ruled 5-4 that, according to the Second Amendment, we did have an individual right to own a firearm. This should have been 9-0. How in the world can you look at the Second Amendment and not conclude that a person, a citizen, has no right to own a firearm? It's impossible. You have to want to see that. We were one vote away from losing that right. We were one vote away from a court saying you do not have an individual right to own a firearm. Therefore, government can do just about anything to regulate gun ownership. We do have regulations. There are about 23,000 gun laws on the books, federal, state, local. Most of them at the federal level require a criminal background check, which is not seen as an infringement. It is, technically, but it's one that we kind of grudgingly go along with because, again, no one sane wants a 3-time murderer to own a gun. They don't want someone who is clinically insane to own a gun. No one wants that. But the battle continues on. Much like the First Amendment is being debated, the Second Amendment is being debated. If you can control information, you have power. If you control weaponry, you have power. You have authority. Therefore, there's always going to be somebody, some group, some large group in some cases, who are going to try to take that power away from you so they have it. Be vigilant. There's no solid evidence that stricter gun control laws mean fewer gun deaths. Matter of fact, you can make a case, a very compelling case, for the opposite of that. Can you tell I'm a little passionate about the Second Amendment? I do. If they can take that away from you, what can they not take away? Think about it. If they can take your guns away, your ability to protect yourself. What's untouchable then? Let's keep going. Third Amendment is kind of a relic of the time. One of the irritations of the time was that British troops had to be housed in colonists' homes if the British troops wanted to be. They couldn't deny them that. This amendment says no. Of course, with the way the military is now, they get plenty of housing. They don't need any of ours. But still, in case that ever becomes a problem, again, there it is. Fourth Amendment, another one of my favorites, protection against unreasonable search and seizure. This amendment basically protects a person's privacy. It limits what law enforcement agents can do when searching a person's property. It must be a legal search. It must be reasonable. It must include a search warrant. That search warrant must contain exactly what you are looking for. And a magistrate or a judge issues that search warrant based on probable cause. Now, we have to put a lot of trust in the judges here that they are properly determining probable cause to issue these warrants. Not much we can do about that. We have to place a lot of trust. That's why, again, we should know if they are trustworthy. That's another story we've talked about several times. The exceptions are if you're actively chasing someone who just committed a crime, you believe, and you arrest them, you can search their person then. The operable word in the amendment is unreasonable. And again, we'll always debate that, but the Fourth Amendment is supposed to protect us against unreasonable search and seizure. Amendments 5 through 8 list the rights granted to those who are accused of crimes. These are situational rights. If you're never accused of a crime, none of this will ever crop up. But again, we talked about most of this before when we talked about the judiciary. We have the presumption of innocence, and that is the key to everything. I have to, as a citizen, if I am charged with a crime, I can give an alibi. I can tell them that I was, this receipt right here at a hotel room shows I was in Baltimore at the time of the murder in Danville or whatever. I can do that, but I don't have to. The government still has to prove I did the murder in Danville. Even though I've got a perfect alibi, and you can bet your bottom dollar I'm going to show them the alibi, but technically I don't have to. They still have to prove I did it. That is the presumption of innocence. Our justice system has the responsibility to respect the accused and continue to assume their innocence. Few other little highlights. You have, you must be indicted by a grand jury. That is, a group of people has to look at the evidence and say, yeah, we got enough reason to go to trial here. Avoiding double jeopardy, that is to say, being tried twice for the same crime. You do not have to testify against yourself if you're charged. When someone pleads the Fifth, that's the Fifth Amendment. That's what they're talking about. The right to the due process of law before being deprived of life, liberty, or property. Due process means essential fairness in providing you a legal process. You have the right to defend yourself. You have the right to make your case. You have the right to cross-examine people who speak out against you. You have the right to face your accuser. Again, you have the right to say, no, I'm not guilty. Here's why. Or, I'm not guilty. Now prove I am. You do have that right. You have the right to a speedy trial and conducted by an impartial jury. You have the right to know what crime you're being charged with. You have the right to have witnesses to appear on your behalf. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford one, someone will be provided to you. That's Miranda rights. You have the right that prevents a judge from throwing out a verdict of a jury. You have the right not to have excessive bail imposed on you, to avoid excessive fines, and what's called cruel and unusual punishments. Now, if that sounds like it's kind of vague, that's because it is. It's kind of hard to, what's cruel and unusual? We don't know. The Constitution assumes the death penalty is not cruel and unusual punishment, although society is moving away from that. Increasingly, society is viewing the death penalty as a cruel and unusual punishment. The Supreme Court, the only action they've taken in that regard was a 1972 case in Georgia where the end result was to force states to rewrite their laws dealing with the death penalty to not apply it so freely, but yeah, according to the Constitution, still the death penalty remains not cruel and unusual. The Ninth Amendment is called the Enumerated Rights Amendment. Alexander Hamilton, our old buddy from the play, Did not want a Bill of Rights. Again, he thought the Constitution as written was sufficient to protect people, but he also knew that it would not include every right, and he was worried that sometime down the road that the federal government may not recognize a right simply because it was not in the Bill of Rights. Well, this amendment says that the listing of the specific rights of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, was not to mean that rights not stated did not exist. It's its own kind of little elastic clause that said, hey, just because something's not in here doesn't mean you can't see it legally as a right. The 10th Amendment. Yeah, we've talked about this a couple of times. My favorite. This embodies the principle of limited government, which has specifically delegated powers. We've said it time and again. Rights that are not specifically given to the federal government are reserved to the states or the people. The federal government and many Americans largely ignore this today. We've talked about this. Unfortunately, if no one is going to abide by the Constitution, it is a worthless old piece of parchment. Its only meaning is that which we assign to it. And if we're going to ignore the 10th, we can ignore the 2nd. We can ignore the 1st. I hope the next generation, you guys and others, will look at this and say, either abide by it or get rid of it. One or the other. Don't ignore it, though. Don't ignore it. Beyond the Bill of Rights, there are other amendments to explore. I'm trying to keep this under an hour. I think I'm doing a good job so far. Some of these are very perfunctory, very, just straightforward things. I'm not going to worry about it. The 11th Amendment basically reaffirms the sovereignty of the states, limits suits against states in federal court, kind of a grungy legal issue. The 12th Amendment changed the way electors vote for president. Basically, they vote for president and the vice president at the same time. They don't vote separately. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were created during and immediately after the Civil War. These are crucial amendments. The 13th basically outlawed slavery. We've talked about the Civil War. Pretty straightforward. Again, states had already done an awful lot of that. Congress also gave states the authority to outlaw what they call the badges and incidents of slavery. That is, the continuing segregation and discrimination. Unfortunately, no one paid a lot of attention to that in the South, and again, this is what happens when you ignore the Constitution. Bad things. Segregation and racial discrimination continued almost unabated throughout the South for the next 100 years or so. The court took a narrow view of this power and did not apply the amendment until many years later, again, after other amendments that we'll talk about took effect. The 14th Amendment, as part of what was called the Civil Rights Act of 1866, it was passed and the Supreme Court said, you got to put this as a constitutional amendment. Okay. And as a matter of fact, to get back into the Union for the southern states, they had to ratify this, or we're not going to let you back in. This is probably the most far-reaching amendment outside the Bill of Rights. It defines citizenship on both the state and national levels. The amendment also forbids states from denying anyone life, liberty, or property without due process of law, what we talked about last time. State cannot arrest you, cannot detain you, cannot take your stuff without telling you exactly why and giving you a chance to speak out, to face your accuser, to cross-examine those who are speaking against you. Another part of the 14th Amendment scrapped the odious 3/5 clause and said, okay, if black people are living in your state, they are a citizen, a full one. Simple enough. The 15th Amendment followed up on this by guaranteeing the right to vote regardless of race, color, or any previous condition of servitude. Now again, states that wanted to discriminate found new ways around this by instituting a poll tax. You go to the poll to vote and they said, give us $5 for all the administrative fees here or whatever. One of the more odious ways was to give people a literacy test. The idea is we don't want some illiterate dumb person voting. Well, what happened is if you had dark skin, they would give you a much tougher test, more likely to fail. States discontinued this after new federal laws and Supreme Court decisions, really in the 1960s. 60 years ago. This is not ancient history. Again, thank God we're turning the corner on this, but it is not an ancient phenomenon. It is a recent phenomenon. The 16th Amendment creates the income tax. Anyway, we know what that is. Congress found that the Supreme Court, that is, found that the income tax that the Congress started during the Civil War to raise money was constitutional. Furthermore, they found that a so-called progressive income tax, where the more you make, the more you pay, was constitutional as well, and the U.S. Congress adopted that, what we have today, progressive income tax, in 1913. Now, it started off very, very straightforward, just a few brackets, few rates. Now the U.S. tax code is as big as 20 Bibles. Yeah, this is one part of government power and authority running amok. But anyway, the 17th Amendment to the Constitution allows for the popular election of U.S. senators. Again, remember, for a long time, state legislatures appointed senators in the state. By this point, in 1917, a lot of states had already gone to popular election of senators, and finally Congress decided, okay, we're going to do it the same way every state. But to do that, again, they had to put in a constitutional amendment. The 18th Amendment, Prohibition, regulated the private sale of alcohol and possession of alcoholic beverages. The time of this was a time of great reform. A lot of people saw the United States as a great experiment in morality, and they pointed to the deleterious effects of alcohol, the impact on the economy, etc., to convince a large number of people, obviously, that prohibition was a good thing. Well, the problem is it regulates private behavior. Here's another little chuckism for you. In the battle between law and appetite, always put your money on appetite. If people want something, they will find a way. If a lot of people want something, they will find a way. This, of course, gave rise to organized crime. It created a lucrative black market. The police were involved, federal law. Nobody in power liked it. Nobody abided by it. This is what happens when you ignore a law. You may as well get rid of it. And that's exactly what we did. 21st Amendment ended prohibition, the only time a constitutional amendment had ever been rescinded. The 19th Amendment of 1920 gave women the right to vote. There were still, at that point, only a few states that did not let women vote. This made it national. Every state had to abide by that. The 23rd Amendment gave 3 electoral votes to the District of Columbia. The 24th Amendment outlawed that terrible poll tax we were telling you about. The Congress passed a law to get rid of it. Supreme Court said, nah, you got to put this in the constitutional amendment. This one very quickly passed. The 26th Amendment lowers the voting age to 18. This took effect. Congress passed this law in 1971. Again, the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. And so they went through the constitutional process, the amendment process, and it was probably the quickest of all the 17 or 18 plus amendments that we ratified. Everybody saw how hypocritical it was to tell 18 to 19 and 20-year-olds that you can be drafted into military service and get killed in service of your country, but you can't vote for the leaders. No, that was very wrong, and we took care of that. Finally, the 27th Amendment, the most recently, deals with changes in salary for members of Congress. They had to pass a constitutional amendment to do that because it was not previously outlined in the Constitution. Basically what that did, and that was 1992, I think, it basically says if in Congress, if you pass a pay raise, it does not take effect until the next congressional session. That is to say, you got to run for re-election to get your new higher salary. Changing the Constitution is the way to do it. Ignoring it is not. Ignoring the Constitution leads to terrible, terrible things. It leads to Jim Crow laws. It leads to discrimination. It leads to terrible, terrible things. If you don't like it, change it. We have a mechanism to do that. Let's get back to these couple of questions I was going to ask you about, based upon what we've talked about here. Largely, again, Bill of Rights is very, very heavy on individual rights, defining them, and we are going to debate the limitations of that as long as we are free. So let's keep debating. Here's a great example I remember from the news just a few years ago. In 2016, the FBI asked Apple to help them unlock a cell phone that a terrorist shooter owned so investigators could find out whom the shooter had contacted. Apple refused to do so, saying that information was privileged and might lead to compromises of personal privacy. Not only for the guy who possessed the cell phone, even though he was a terrorist, it would also compromise the privacy of the others, his other contacts. What are your thoughts? Should a cell phone company have to comply with such a request from law enforcement? Should the government be able to force a company like Apple to help with an investigation? Is the potential knowledge that the government can gain from such imposition worth the loss of personal freedom and privacy? Remember the issue we talked about last week? Should 10 guilty ones go free so that one innocent one is not jailed? This kind of falls along those lines. Think about that. Think about this one also. We've talked a lot about free speech here. This is something that is contemporary, and it's regional based upon the number of flags we see flying around our fair city. Does free speech include the right to display the Confederate flag, other Confederate memorabilia? How about the communist flag, or the Nazi flag, or other controversial items? Does free speech cover your display of those controversial items? These are great questions. This was a great lesson. I hope I can calm down now. That is week 9. Folks, next week we're going to be breaking away from the Constitution for the first time to talk a little bit more about federal government, but also about state government. We've focused in Washington now. We're going to move to 50 state capitals next week. Folks, have a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday.